Welcome to the all-new Hoop Nova, your ultimate source for everything basketball.
The Nuggets are wasting Jokic and it could cost them everything. Denver Nuggets won the NBA championship in 20-3. At the time, it looked like the beginning of an era. Nikola Jokic was finally on top of the basketball world. Jamal Murray was healthy. Aaron Gordon was playing his role perfectly. The roster had chemistry, experience, and arguably the best player on the planet. But 3 years later, that championship is starting to look less like the beginning of a dynasty, and more like the peak of a window that Denver completely failed to maximize. Because the Nuggets haven't returned to the conference finals since that title. And after another disappointing playoff exit, the bigger question isn't whether Denver can contend next season. It's whether Nikola Jokic will eventually decide that his best chance to win another championship is somewhere else. That's where this situation gets scary. Jokic has reportedly chosen not to rush into another extension, instead waiting until the offseason when he can potentially maximize his earnings. On the surface, that's completely reasonable. Why would a superstar leave tens of millions of dollars on the table? Jokic himself has downplayed the situation and made it clear that he wants to remain in Denver. But there's an important distinction. Wanting to stay today doesn't necessarily mean he'll want to stay 2 years from now. And if Denver continues making the same mistakes, they may eventually give him a reason to change his mind. The biggest problem is simple. The Nuggets have an expensive roster that isn't good enough. And that is one of the worst combinations an NBA team can have. Look at Jamal Murray. Denver gave its second star a massive contract. Despite a history of injuries and inconsistency, Murray has produced some incredible playoff moments, especially during the 2023 championship run. But his availability has repeatedly been an issue. The bigger question is this: was Denver actually competing against another team for Murray's services? Because if nobody was realistically offering him that kind of money, Denver had leverage. Instead, they paid him like they couldn't afford to lose him. That's the danger of building around loyalty instead of value. And Murray isn't the only problem. Denver has committed significant money to players who haven't consistently performed at the level required for a championship contender. Christian Braun has received criticism for his contract value, while Zeke Nagy has struggled to justify his place financially. Suddenly, the Nuggets aren't just trying to build a better team, they're trying to build a better team while carrying contracts that make major upgrades extremely difficult. And then there's Peyton Watson. This is where things become even more interesting. Watson is one of the young players Denver needs to develop if it wants to remain competitive around Jokic. But when contract negotiations become difficult, other teams notice, and Oklahoma City has already demonstrated exactly how aggressive it can be financially. The Thunder have accumulated assets, draft picks, and flexibility. 4 years. Denver doesn't have that luxury anymore. Every dollar matters. And that's because the Nuggets could be facing an enormous luxury tax bill if they decide to keep everyone. We're talking about a franchise that historically hasn't operated like the Warriors or Clippers when it comes to massive luxury tax spending. So now Denver faces a brutal choice. Do they spend a fortune to keep the current roster together, or do they let another important piece walk away? Either option creates a problem, because Jokic needs help. And the cruelest part is that Denver may actually have an escape route. There have been reports of teams showing interest in taking on difficult contracts if they can also acquire young talent. That could give Denver financial flexibility. But there's a catch. Every move that saves the front office money could potentially make Jokic's supporting cast weaker. And that's exactly what Jokic has to be watching. Because this isn't just about one contract. It's about a pattern. After winning the championship, Denver largely chose to keep the same core together while increasing the financial commitment. That strategy can work for a year or two, but eventually, age gets more expensive, veterans get harder to retain, young players become eligible for bigger contracts, and suddenly, the championship roster that looked perfect becomes financially impossible to maintain. The Milwaukee Bucks experienced a similar problem. They continued paying veteran players after winning their championship, and eventually the roster became increasingly difficult to reshape. The lesson for Denver should be obvious. You can't stay emotionally attached to every player from a championship team. The NBA changes too quickly. Young talent has to replace expensive veterans. Role players have to outperform their contracts. And the front office has to constantly find value. Denver hasn't done enough of that. Instead, the team has kept paying familiar names while allowing its depth to disappear. Players leave, others become too expensive, and Jokic is left carrying an enormous amount of responsibility. That's why the situation is becoming uncomfortable, because eventually Jokic has to ask himself, what exactly am I staying for? If Denver is willing to spend huge money on the existing roster but isn't willing to make the aggressive moves necessary to improve it, then what is the plan? And there's another question nobody wants to ask. What if Jokic eventually decides that winning isn't worth sacrificing money? He could potentially earn an enormous contract by staying in Denver. At some point in his career, choosing the maximum salary over a championship chase would be completely understandable. But if Jokic truly wants another title, Denver needs to give him a reason to believe it can happen. And that's why the next season could be enormous. Because if Denver disappoints again, the pressure changes completely. Suddenly, every trade rumor becomes more serious. Every contract decision becomes important. Every missed opportunity gets magnified. And every time another contender improves, Nuggets fans have to wonder whether their window is closing. Now let's take this one step further. If Jokic ever decides he actually wants out, the entire NBA would explode. A superstar of his caliber becoming available would immediately turn the league upside down. And one team that could become particularly interesting is Golden State. The Warriors are entering a period where major contracts could come off the books, potentially creating financial flexibility. Imagine Jokic playing alongside Stephen Curry. It sounds almost impossible, but that's exactly why Denver cannot afford to become complacent. The Nuggets already have the hardest part of team building. They have Nikola Jokic. The problem is what they're doing around him. A generational superstar doesn't come around often. Championship windows don't stay open forever, and Denver may already be wasting one. So the question isn't whether Jokic deserves more money. Of course he does. The real question is whether the Nuggets can build a roster around him that actually makes those millions meaningful. Because if Denver keeps choosing expensive familiarity over smart roster construction, eventually Jokic may have to make the decision that nobody in Denver wants to hear: stay loyal to the franchise, or leave and chase another championship somewhere else. And if that day comes, the Nuggets won't be able to say they weren't warned. The scary part for Denver is that Jokic may eventually have only two realistic choices. He can stay in Denver, make an unbelievable amount of money, and potentially spend the rest of his career trying to squeeze another championship out of a roster that keeps getting harder to build around. Or he could eventually decide that his best chance to win again is somewhere else. And if that second option ever becomes real, the entire NBA changes overnight. Now, some people will say that would never happen. Jokic is loyal. He loves Denver. He's not a ring chaser. And maybe they're right. But I'm not completely convinced that Jokic's personality is really about loyalty. I think it's something slightly different. Jokic simply doesn't seem obsessed with winning in the same way that some of the all-time great competitors have been. Look at Kobe Bryant. Back in 2007, Kobe was so frustrated with the Lakers situation that he publicly made it clear he wasn't willing to waste his prime on a team that wasn't serious about competing. That wasn't a bluff. Kobe wanted a championship badly enough that he was willing to force the organization to make changes, and eventually, the Lakers acquired Pau Gasol. The rest is history. Kobe won 3 more championships after that and finished his career with 5 rings. Stephen Curry is another example. Steph stayed with Golden State, but he also spent years helping the organization maintain a championship-level environment. And then there's Dirk Nowitzki. This is probably the most interesting comparison for Jokic. Dirk spent his entire career with Dallas and won only one championship. But that one championship became incredibly meaningful because everyone knew what Dirk sacrificed to get there. As he got older, He accepted smaller contracts to give the Mavericks more flexibility. He wasn't just saying he wanted to win. He was actively helping the franchise build a team around him. That's what made the relationship between Dirk and Dallas feel like a partnership. And that's the question I have about Jokic. If Denver eventually reaches a point where Jokic is making an enormous amount of money while the team around him is getting weaker, will Nuggets fans still feel like they're all in this together? Because if Jokic takes every dollar available to him, while Denver simultaneously has to cut important players because of the salary cap, the relationship becomes more complicated. And this is where the NBA's second-apron rules become extremely important. A lot of fans hear second-apron and assume it simply means superstars are making too much money. That's not really what it means. The money doesn't disappear. NBA players are collectively guaranteed roughly half of the league's basketball-related income. So if one superstar takes less money, that money can effectively become available for other players. There is also an escrow system that helps make sure the players receive their agreed share of league revenue. In simple terms, the issue isn't whether the money exists. The issue is how teams distribute it. And that's exactly where Denver has created a problem. If you give huge contracts to multiple veteran players, eventually you run out of flexibility. Then your superstar is making superstar money. Your veterans are making big money. Your young players become eligible for extensions. And suddenly, there's almost nothing left to improve the roster. That's the trap Denver appears to be facing. And ironically, Jokic taking a slightly smaller contract could actually help the Nuggets build a stronger team around him. It sounds crazy. Why should one of the greatest players in basketball give up money? But that's the entire point. If Jokic sacrifices some salary and Denver uses that flexibility intelligently, the money can go toward multiple quality players instead of one giant contract. That could mean better defenders, better depth, more shooting, more athleticism, and ultimately, a roster capable of making another championship run. But here's the problem. That strategy only works if Denver's front office uses the extra flexibility correctly. They simply take advantage of Jokic's sacrifice and then continue handing out questionable contracts to older players. Then what's the point? That's exactly the mistake teams like Milwaukee eventually found themselves dealing with. After winning a championship, the natural instinct is to keep everyone together. You become attached to the players who helped you win. You reward them. You keep extending the veterans. And for a while, everything looks fine. But the NBA doesn't care about what your roster did 2 or 3 years ago. It only cares about what those contracts are worth today. Eventually, those expensive players become harder to move. The young talent becomes too expensive to retain. And the superstar is left carrying the team. That's how a championship roster slowly turns into an expensive roster that can't actually compete. And Denver has to avoid that outcome because Jokic is not getting younger. Every season matters. Every wasted playoff run matters. And every time the Nuggets lose another valuable piece because they can't afford to keep him, Jokic gets another reason to question the situation. Maybe Jokic will stay forever. Maybe he'll take the money, remain in Denver, and become the greatest one franchise player in Nuggets history. That would be an incredible story. But if Denver keeps making the same financial mistakes, eventually loyalty may not be enough. And that's the part Nuggets fans should be watching. Not whether Jokic says he wants to stay today. Watch what Denver does around him. Because if the front office can build a younger, deeper, and more competitive roster, Jokic has every reason to stay. But if the team keeps getting older, more expensive, and less talented, then eventually, even the most relaxed superstar in the NBA might start asking himself one uncomfortable question: is Denver really giving me the best chance to win another championship? And if the answer ever becomes no, that's when the Jokic era could enter its most dangerous chapter.